I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm reading Chapter 3 of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. It's from Section 1, Pieces of Slave, and it's called The Plantocracy. The full text will be at thirdparadigm.substack.com, along with the first two chapters. In those two chapters, I showed why we cannot vote our way out of this or tax our way out of this, because both democracy and taxation were designed to co-opt the masses. In this chapter, I'll show why reparations for slavery can't get us out of this, because it would have to include almost all of us. I wrote this chapter before I had seen the 3-hour documentary called The 13 Sugar Colonies, which I got from Julius Schoolafish and his book mentions. This is a critically important and meticulously documented history, mostly told by Black scholars. Here is the YouTube description. This is a story of a rather unknown history of Zionism. Before the theft and colonization of Palestine, there was the colonization of 13 sugar colonies in the Americas and Caribbean, which brought about the sugar and slave trade and the birth of globalized capitalism. Join educational discussions by legit scholars and historians, both Black and Jewish professors, who have discussed the 13 sugar colonies and the impact they played on the Black Holocaust. No matter how much they want to hide the history, there is no longer any debate. The evidence is overwhelming. In this chapter, when I look at white slavery in the 1600s and 1700s, the culprits are the same. The same money powers owned the kings and queens, financed the slave ships, hired the slave traders, financed conquistadors. Christopher Columbus was Sephardic. The City of London is this 1 square mile housing the global fire economy of finance, insurance, and real estate. Both it and Israel are owned by the Rothschilds. The Pope kisses the Rothschild's ring, and DC kisses Rothschild's ass. Perhaps Rothschild answers to the Doge, the Venetian black nobility, the same name as Trump's new department and Elon's crypto coin. The term crypto meant a secret Sephardi in the 1600s and 1700s. By the end of these 2 centuries of white slavery, the Bank of England was established. Let's look at how much blood built that fortune. From Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. Slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly identified with the Negro. A racial twist has therefore been given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. Unfree labor in the New World was brown, white, black, and yellow, Catholic, Protestant, and pagan. And then from Jonathan Swift, the Dublin satirist and political pamphleteer, laws are like cobwebs, which may catch small flies, but let wasps and hornets break through. The Plantocracy. A millennium after the Axial Age, the infant empires of the barbarian countries were all grown up. Tiny Portugal claimed the longest-lasting global empire, starting with the invasion of Ceuta in 1415 and ending with the ceding of East Timor in 2002. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain established the first empire on which the sun never set, before England nabbed the dubious distinction. France ruled the second largest empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, covering 1/10 of the world's surface. But the grand dominatrix emerged as Great Britain, holding its scepter over the heads of 1/5 of the world's population on 1/4 of the globe's total landmass. Or perhaps the tiny Vatican overwhelmed them all with the Holy Roman Empire, as John Isbister indicates in Promises Not Kept. He writes, "The soldiers were followed soon after by the friars, whose sacred mission it was to salvage souls, and who succeeded at the expense of wiping out whole cultures. It would be hard to say whether the soldiers or the priests were more destructive. Together in their search for wealth, hegemony, and spiritual conversion, they dominated a continent, destroying millions of lives and subjecting the survivors to servitude. So the horror and devastation that European explorers and settlers caused in the Americas, the Caribbean, or Africa cannot be overstated. Voices that tell the real stories from the perspective of the abducted and invaded are just emerging now. There is a surge in films and books, in genres from historical fiction to science fiction, that illustrate not just the victimization, but the power of resistance. We're finally reclaiming our shared past and using it to reshape the future. But even less known are the stories that preceded these, of what was done to the near enemy who didn't accept their place in the pyramid of capitocracy. These members of the master race were separated only by class, yet their treatment shows that those who lived under the empire's nose were no safer than those who lived under the empire's thumb. The debt of the conquistadors. Behind every imperial monarch stood a banker, pen sharpened to a knife. The crown was a jewel-studded collar connected to a leash of debt, from which the financiers commanded their purebred pooch to fetch them profits and mete out punishments. If the dog's head rolled, it didn't matter because the debts had already rolled downhill. In one example, David Graeber informs us that the conquistadors were bound in ever-deepening obligations to the kings and queens who financed them. Always just one step ahead of their creditors, nearly all died in debt, and the gold and silver they plundered passed through royal hands on its way to financiers in Genoa, Florence, and Naples. The atrocities committed and treasures amassed were never enough to satisfy the backers who financed both the wars and the explorations of the indebted crown. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694 formalized that relationship. Rather than currency representing debts owed to the king, the circulating banknotes represented debt owed by the king to the 40 London and Edinburgh merchants who financed William III's war against France. Merchants became the power behind the throne. In debt, David Graeber writes, amongst all the bubbles of the 18th century involved some fantastic scheme to use the proceeds of colonial ventures to pay for European wars. Paper money was debt money, and debt money was war money, and this has always remained the case. Kidnapping for fun and profit. In The Culture of Make-Believe, Derrick Jensen writes, at the request of the Virginia Company, a British bill passed in 1618 permitting the capture of children of 8 years or older to be transported as slaves to America, where the boys were to be owned by the company for up to 16 years, the girls up to 14. Officials were paid a bounty by the company for each kid they nabbed, and judges received up to 50% of the profits from the sale of children. So constables roamed the streets looking for children, while aldermen entered the homes of the poor to look for more. In the colonies, mortality rates for these children often reached 90 to 95% within 5 years. Between 1609 and the early 1800s, as many as 2/3 of the white colonists are estimated to have been forced to come over as slaves. For indentured teenagers, mortality was also high. In some colonies, 1/3 to half of indentured teenagers didn't live to see their freedom, while in others, up to 80% died in their first year. In addition to children, Jensen elaborates, Hundreds of thousands of political dissidents were enslaved by the British Crown and transported to the colonies. This had the double benefit of eliminating the troublemakers in the near territories and providing labor to the plantation colonies. 1/10 a slave. For the planters, indentured servants were preferable to chattel slavery because buyers paid only for the passage and not the slave. At 3 to 5 pounds per head, payable to the mercantile companies, servants were a fraction of the cost of African slaves, who sold for 50 pounds. Servants were also less likely to rebel. Convicts could still be hanged, and those who had been tricked or had chosen to come over would blame themselves. One technicality remained. Christians couldn't permanently enslave other Christians, and the same went for Jews. This was gotten around by the device that the ship passage itself created the bond of 7 years' debt servitude, even if the person had been abducted. And when they'd completed payment of the 7-year bond, they were owed 100 acres as recompense for their labor. This created a reverse incentive for keeping them alive until their release. In the seminal 1944 study, Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams writes, "The hope has been expressed that the servants were spared the lash so liberally bestowed upon their Negro comrades. They had no such good fortune. Since they were bound for a limited period, the planter had less interest in their welfare than in that of the Negroes, who were perpetual servants and therefore the most useful appurtenances of a plantation." Peter Beresford Ellis confirms this point in Hell or Connaught by quoting an escaped slave. "The toil imposed upon them is much harder than what they enjoin the Negroes, their slaves, for these they endeavor to preserve, being their perpetual bondsmen. But these white servants they care not whether they live or die." 300 Ways to Die or Wish You Had. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia granted 50 acres per head to those transported a servant from Europe. Therefore, a person of moderate means could pay for both his passage and 4 2-by-6-foot berths for 4 servants. When he arrived, 2 servants could be traded for 100 acres, which could then be farmed using the other 2. Williams found that white indentured servants constituted half of all English immigrants during the colonial period. Convicts were a reliable stream, since there were 300 crimes punishable by death under feudal English law. They included pickpocketing more than a shilling or poaching a rabbit on a gentleman's estate, but conveniently for the colonies, transportation could be substituted for hanging. Transportation was also the penalty for trade union activity, for Quakers refusing 3 times to take an oath, for formalizing marriage vows in secret, or for persons assembling in groups of 5 or more under the pretense of religion. The book White Cargo by Jordan Michael Walsh reports on the beginnings of Irish enslavement, when King James II sent 30,000 political prisoners to the New World. His 1625 proclamation required that all Irish political prisoners henceforth be sold to English settlers in the West Indies. They ended up supplying the majority of labor to Antigua and Montserrat. Barbados for their own good. After the siege of Drogheda in 1649, the bleeding of Ireland began in earnest. In 1655, Lord Cromwell was asked by the Virginia Company of London to send 1,000 Irish wenches to Virginia. He replied, "Concerning the young women, although we must use force in taking them up, yet it being so much for their own good, and likely to be of so great advantage to the public, it is not the least doubted that you may have such a number of them as you shall think fit to make upon this account." Lord Cromwell, generous to a fault, added that 1,500 to 2,000 Irish boys aged 12 to 14 could also be captured and sent. In a single decade from 1641 to 1652, the British killed over 500,000 Irish, who were either rebels or mere bystanders, and then sold 300,000 as slaves. The population dropped from 1.5 million people to 600,000, leaving mostly homeless women and children. During the 1650s, over 100,000 children between 10 and 14 were taken from their parents and shipped to the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. Over 62,000 more women and children were transported to Barbados and wherever else the empire needed cheap labor. The verb to Barbados a person even entered the language as English slang. Confessions of a Celtic Cargo. Fiction that reimagines actual events can give voice and character to the losers in a history written by the winners. In Testimony of an Irish Slave Girl, Kate McCafferty tells the story of an 11-year-old girl snatched off the street in Galway and shipped to Barbados. With vivid and poignant detail, she follows her character from being a young house servant, dandled by the master and resented by the mistress, to being sold off to another slave owner as a field hand after she betrays a slave revolt. Lacing together factual accounts and dramatization, McCafferty shows the young girl growing up quickly, laboring in the blistering sun and fending for herself after the other slaves cast her out as a traitor. At maturity, she's mated with a Muslim African man, as was policy in Barbados for Irish women through the interbreeding program. But this turned out to be her turning point. Finding strength in community, the Africans and Irish unite in an Islamic jihad, which redeems her even though it ends in failure and torture. As a bondswoman, she is eventually freed, but her half-African children, separated from her at birth, remain slaves for life. As a mother, there is little freedom in having her children still bound. In the preface, McCafferty states her own reasons for writing the book. History has proven that the Irish were not docile bondsmen, whether at home or abroad. The novel which follows is the story of a fictional Irish woman, trepanned to the island of Barbados in the year 1650 and sold into bondage, and of her imagined participation in one of the historically verifiable plans, undertaken jointly between Irish and African slaves to overthrow the plantocracy of the island. The Irish perspective is important to the history of resistance to colonialism. It is also important because involuntary indentured servants laid the foundation for African chattel slavery in Barbados. But perhaps it is most important at the beginning of the 21st century as part of a little-known history of affiliation across race and ethnicity between groups conventionally defined as incompatible. Depopulating the kingdom. For decades after, the deportation of lower-class English and Irish continued unabated. But then one day, the royalty had a sudden and uncharacteristic awakening of conscience. A wealthy nobleman strolled into a court where the judge was sentencing the unfortunate masses, and in a burst of moral rectitude upbraided the magistrate and put him in the dock for the crime of corruption. Across the country, the unspoken permission was abruptly rescinded and the chain of bribery broken. While history celebrates this reversal as a rare instance of the powerful defending the helpless, Williams has put forward a more pernicious explanation for Britain's change of heart. He writes, "By the end of the 17th century, the stress had shifted from the accumulation of the precious metals as the aim of national economic policy to the development of industry within the country, the promotion of employment, and the encouragement of exports. The mercantilist argued that the best way to reduce costs and thereby compete with other countries was to pay low wages, which a large population tended to ensure. He quotes Sir Hosea Child that whatever tends to the depopulating of a kingdom tends to the impoverishment of it. Child's concern was not for families torn apart and children sold into servitude, but for the loss of domestic workers. England, in other words, had decided to indenture its own servants at home rather than outsourcing their lower classes. The hopeful legacy of gingers. In White Cargo, the authors object to reserving the term slavery exclusively for those of African heritage. They write, "It invites uproar to describe as slaves any of these hapless whites who were abused, beaten, and sometimes killed by their masters or their masters' overseers. To do so is thought to detract from the enormity of black suffering after racial slavery developed. However, black slavery emerged out of white servitude and was based upon it. The indentured servant system evolved into slavery because of the economic goals of early colonists. It was designed not so much to help would-be migrants get to America and the Caribbean as to provide a cheap and compliant workforce for the cash crop industry. Once this was established, to keep the workforce in check, it became necessary to create legal sanctions that included violence and physical restraint. This was what led to slavery, first for whites, then for blacks. What the aftermath of white slavery demonstrates is actually very hopeful. In the U.S., at least, there's no lasting bias against people with red hair and freckles. The brutality exhibited by the masters of indentured servants, and surely there were exceptions who treated them with decency, went against human nature. When the economic circumstances changed, so did the prejudice. Likewise, my hope is that racism was and is a response to adversarial relationships imposed through economics, not human nature. Rather than dividing people into conquered and conquering, my purpose is to look at the ways in which the system makes everyone both victim and aggressor, slave and master, innocent bystander and collaborator. A holistic approach looks at people as the products of their environment and sees the economy as the primary driver of the environment. Instead of apportioning blame and guilt by defining racism as cause, not effect, an organic remedy heals the ground in which racism grows. Divided we fall, together we change the system. Because I've written this as a text, at the end of every chapter, I outline the paradigm shifts that have happened, and then I have a lexicon and discussion questions. So the paradigm shift in this chapter is: slavery subjugated whites before it subjugated blacks. Slavery was not about race, but about economics. Racism was a result of slavery. Slavery was not a result of racism. Slavery chews up land and spits out people: white, black, brown, yellow, red. And for more, here is Chapter 1, A Democracy of Slave Owners, and this is Chapter 2, Making a Market for Plunder. Thank you for watching.